Sussex, England, 15th of August 1940. A German reconnaissance aircraft drones overhead, its crew photographing coastal defences along Britain's southern shore. Below, in a sun-dappled field beside a country lane, three men in Home Guard uniform huddle around what appears to be an ordinary farm cart. Two spoked wheels, a wooden axle, the sort of thing you'd see carrying hay to market. The aircraft passes. One of the men glances upward, then reaches beneath the cart's undercarriage. A pin slides free. The entire structure tips backwards, the wheels rising off the ground like a beast rearing up. Where the axle was, there's now a 3-inch bore staring skyward at a 45-degree angle. The cart wasn't a cart at all. It was a gun. A gun that hid behind its own wheels. Within seconds, the Home Guard crew have it loaded. A high explosive shell slides into the breech. The wheels, now positioned vertically in front of the gunners, form a makeshift shield. If German paratroopers had dropped from that aircraft, those wheels would have been the only thing between the crew and incoming rifle fire. One man sights along the barrel, another stands ready with a lanyard. The whole apparatus weighs less than a motorcycle. This is the Smith gun. The strangest, most ingenious piece of battlefield improvisation Britain ever fielded. A weapon that could be towed behind a Morris 8, hidden in a hedgerow, crewed by men too old for frontline service, and still punch a 3-inch hole through the side of a German tank. In the summer of 1940, when invasion seemed inevitable and proper anti-tank guns were as rare as French optimism, the Smith gun was Britain's answer to a question no one wanted to ask. What do you arm civilians with when the professionals have nothing left to give? By June 1940, Britain had a problem that statistics made terrifyingly clear. The British Expeditionary Force had evacuated from Dunkirk, but most of its heavy equipment had not. Left behind on the beaches and in the ports were 2,472 artillery pieces, 63,879 vehicles, and nearly all of the Army's anti-tank guns. The standard 2-pounder anti-tank gun, of which barely 170 remained in the entire country, took months to manufacture and required a trained crew of 6. Production capacity stood at perhaps 20 per week. German intelligence estimated Britain held fewer than 500 modern anti-tank weapons. They weren't far wrong. The Germans, meanwhile, had 3,500 tanks ready for Operation Sea Lion. Even if only half made it across the Channel, that left Britain facing roughly 17 tanks for every anti-tank gun in existence. The mathematics were impossible. Field Marshal Sir Edmund Ironside, commanding Home Forces, put it more bluntly in his diary: "We have not the guns to defend this coast." What Britain did have was the Home Guard, nearly 1.5 million men, most of them veterans of the Great War, armed initially with shotguns, sporting rifles, and, in some cases, pikes. These weren't soldiers in any conventional sense. They were shopkeepers, farmers, postal workers, and retired clerks who drilled twice a week and guarded roadblocks at night. Official doctrine called them a delaying force. A speed bump, something to slow the Germans down whilst the regular army repositioned. But doctrine required weapons, and there were none to spare. Existing anti-tank solutions failed to bridge this gap for reasons both practical and industrial. The boy's anti-tank rifle, already borderline obsolete, weighed 36 pounds and required weeks of training to use effectively. The 2-pounder anti-tank gun weighed 800 pounds on its carriage, needed a lorry to move, and couldn't be effectively concealed. Production of the new 6-pounder wouldn't begin until late 1941. Britain needed something that didn't exist. An anti-tank weapon light enough to be manhandled by aging volunteers, cheap enough to manufacture by the thousand, and powerful enough to actually threaten German armour. Every existing design optimized for two of those three requirements. None achieved all three. The Ministry of Supply ran the numbers. To adequately defend the invasion beaches would require 12,000 anti-tank guns. At current production rates, achieving that number would take 11 years. The Germans were expected in 11 weeks. Enter Major William Henry Smith, a retired banking official and engineer who'd spent the 1930s designing agricultural machinery in Essex. Smith had served in the Royal Engineers during the Great War, then returned to civilian life and relative obscurity. He was precisely the sort of person you'd expect to command a Home Guard platoon, not revolutionize weapons design. In early July 1940, he approached the War Office with sketches for what he called a universal mounting for a smoothbore gun. The officials who examined his drawings couldn't quite believe what they were looking at. Smith's innovation was radical in its simplicity. Take a 3-inch steel tube, roughly the diameter of a drain pipe, mount it on a wheeled carriage, but make the mounting such that the entire assembly could tip backwards, using the wheels themselves as a shield and stabilizing base. Forget rifling, which required precision machining, make it smoothbore, firing fin-stabilized projectiles. Forget complex recoil mechanisms. Let the gun slide backwards along its mounting when fired, dissipating energy through friction. Forget trained crews. Make it simple enough that 3 men who'd never seen a proper artillery piece could learn to operate it in an afternoon. The War Office gave Smith 3 weeks to produce a working prototype. He delivered in 2. The prototype, constructed at a small engineering works in Dagenham, weighed 560 pounds, complete with carriage and wheels. A pair of reasonably fit men could push it. Any vehicle with a tow hitch could pull it. The barrel measured 3 feet long, with a 3-inch bore diameter that matched existing naval ammunition stocks. No special shells required, at least not initially. The whole thing could be manufactured from mild steel using equipment available at any provincial machine shop. Trials at Shoeburyness in late July produced results that astonished observers. From 200 yards, the Smith gun punched through 60 millimeters of armor plate, sufficient to defeat any German tank then in service. From 100 yards, it could penetrate 75 millimeters. A direct hit from that range would gut a Panzer III like a tin can. The gun's simplicity proved both strength and weakness. Without rifling, accuracy beyond 300 yards was hopeful at best, but for a weapon designed to ambush tanks from hedgerows and behind stone walls, 300 yards was all you needed. The firing mechanism was almost absurdly straightforward. A crewman pulled a lanyard which released a spring-loaded striker, which hit a percussion cap at the shell's base. Bang! No electricity, no complex primers, nothing that could fail in the mud. The shell itself was stabilized by folding fins that deployed after leaving the barrel, similar to the Blacker Bombard's projectiles. These fins kept the round more or less on target, compensating for the lack of spin a rifled barrel would provide. Range: roughly 500 yards against vehicles, perhaps 900 yards for area bombardment. Muzzle velocity: approximately 600 feet per second, slow by artillery standards, but adequate for the ranges involved. Manufacturing dispersed across Britain almost immediately. The Ministry of Supply placed initial orders for 3,000 guns in August 1940, with production facilities established at engineering works in Birmingham, Sheffield, and Coventry. Additional contracts went to firms that had previously made boilers, agricultural equipment, and, in one case, brewery vats. By October, monthly production exceeded 200 units. By December, it had reached 350. The design's genius lay in this manufacturability. Complex anti-tank guns required specialist machinery and skilled machinists. The Smith gun required a lathe, a welder, and competent but not exceptional metal workers. Britain had plenty of all three. Each gun came with a crew of 3, though in practice 2 could manage if necessary. The first man, designated the layer, aimed the weapon using rudimentary iron sights. The second man loaded shells from a wooden ammunition box that held 6 rounds. The third man pulled the lanyard and maintained watch for targets. Rate of fire under ideal conditions, 6 rounds per minute. In reality, perhaps 4, accounting for the awkwardness of handling 15-pound shells whilst crouching behind bicycle-sized wheels. The whole operation required communication by shouting. The Smith gun's operational deployment followed patterns dictated by Britain's defensive strategy in late 1940 and early 1941. Home Guard units received the first deliveries, with priority given to coastal sectors deemed most vulnerable to invasion. Sussex, Kent and East Anglia saw concentrations of 30 to 40 guns per county by October 1940. Records from the War Office indicate that approximately 1,800 Smith guns had been distributed to Home Guard battalions by January 1941. Though exact figures remain uncertain due to the weapon's quasi-official status and distributed production. In practice, Home Guard commanders positioned the guns in locations that maximized their strengths whilst concealing their considerable weaknesses. Crossroads received particular attention. A Smith gun hidden behind a stone wall at a rural intersection with clear lines of fire down both approach roads could theoretically engage German armour at optimal range without exposing its crew. Hedgerows provided natural camouflage. Fields of fire were cleared, lines of sight measured, and in some cases, false positions prepared to draw enemy fire away from the actual gun emplacements. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Training manuals from late 1940 emphasize the weapon's role in ambush tactics. Home Guard crews were instructed to allow enemy vehicles to pass prepared killing zones before opening fire, targeting rear elements of convoys rather than lead vehicles. The logic was coldly practical. Disabled vehicles blocking a road caused more disruption than destroyed ones that could be pushed aside. Psychological impact mattered as much as kinetic effect. A tank crew under fire from an unseen gun would button up, reducing visibility and making the vehicle vulnerable to close-range assault from infantry with petrol bombs. Documented accounts of the Smith gun in actual combat are predictably sparse, given that Operation Sea Lion never materialized. The weapon saw no action against German forces on British soil. However, limited numbers were deployed overseas, primarily in North Africa and the Middle East, where records suggest mixed results. A report from the 8th Army in Libya, dated March 1942, mentions Smith guns being used for defensive positions around supply dumps, though with the caveat that crews found the weapon temperamental in desert conditions. Sand infiltration caused the sliding breech mechanism to jam, requiring constant maintenance. Comparing the Smith gun to its contemporaries reveals both its peculiar strengths and glaring deficiencies. The German Panzerbüchse 39 anti-tank rifle, standard equipment for Wehrmacht infantry, weighed 26 pounds and fired a 7.92 mm round capable of penetrating 30 mm of armour at 100 meters. Effective range, 300 meters against light vehicles, useless against anything heavier. Crew, 1 man. The boy's rifle, Britain's equivalent, showed similar limitations. Both weapons were essentially oversized rifles, portable but increasingly ineffective as tank armor thickened. The American M337mm anti-tank gun, introduced in 1940, offered superior performance but at considerable cost. Weight, 912 pounds with carriage. Crew, 5 men minimum. Penetration, 61 mm at 500 yards. Rate of fire, up to 20 rounds per minute in trained hands. The M3 was a proper artillery piece, mobile only when towed by a vehicle, requiring trained crews and regular maintenance. It could destroy German tanks with confidence at ranges the Smith gun could barely reach. But Britain couldn't build them fast enough, and the Americans weren't sharing. The Blacker bombard, developed roughly contemporaneously with the Smith gun, represented a different approach to the same problem. A spigot mortar firing a 20-pound bomb, the bombard could lob high-explosive rounds over obstacles at ranges up to 450 yards. Against vehicles, it relied on blast effect rather than armour penetration. Weight, 375 pounds, lighter than the Smith gun but requiring a fixed mount. The bombard excelled at defensive positions where indirect fire was valuable. The Smith gun offered direct fire, flatter trajectories, and better penetration against armoured targets. Both weapons filled gaps in Britain's defences, neither was ideal. German attempts at equivalent weapons largely focused on recoilless rifles, which wouldn't enter production until later in the war. The closest comparison might be the Panzerschreck or the Panzerfaust, neither of which existed in 1940. Germany's confidence in its conventional anti-tank guns meant it saw no need for improvised solutions. Britain's desperation drove innovation that Germany, from a position of strength, never required. Where the Smith gun genuinely excelled was in the specific tactical scenario for which it was designed: untrained or minimally trained crews, defensive ambush positions, short engagement ranges, targets of opportunity. In those circumstances, its simplicity became an advantage. A Home Guard unit that had never operated a real artillery piece could be shown how to load, aim, and fire the Smith gun in a single afternoon. The same unit attempting to operate a 2-pounder would require weeks of instruction. When you're expecting invasion in August, and it's currently July, afternoon instruction beats weeks every time. The Smith gun's actual impact on the war effort is difficult to quantify with precision, largely because the weapon existed in a twilight zone between official adoption and desperate improvisation. Production continued until mid-1943, by which time approximately 4,000 units had been manufactured. This figure comes from Ministry of Supply records, though some historians suggest the actual number may have been higher, with small batches produced at facilities that kept poor records or whose documentation was lost in bombing raids. What the weapon undeniably provided was psychological reassurance at a moment when such reassurance was desperately needed. In August 1940, Home Guard units across southern England were drilling with broomsticks and waiting for anti-tank rifles that didn't exist. By October, many of those same units had Smith guns. The weapons weren't perfect. They weren't even particularly good by conventional military standards, but they were real, they were there, and they could theoretically kill a tank. That mattered. The gun's influence on subsequent weapons development is more speculative than documentable. Recoilless rifles, which became common in the late 1940s and 1950s, employed similar principles of simplicity and ease of manufacture. The American M18 recoilless rifle, introduced in 1944, was a direct conceptual descendant. Lightweight, smoothbore, capable of being operated by a small crew, effective against armour at short ranges. Whether American designers studied the Smith gun directly is unclear. The concepts, however, align remarkably well. In the broader context of Home Guard armament, the Smith gun represented one element of a comprehensive, if chaotic, effort to weaponize Britain's civilian defense forces. Alongside the Northover projector, the Blacker bombard, the sticky bomb, and various improvised explosives, the Smith gun formed part of what might generously be called an integrated anti-invasion system, or, more accurately, a collection of desperate measures unified by their shared inadequacy when compared to proper military equipment. This inadequacy wasn't unique to British designs. Every nation that found itself suddenly on the defensive in 1940 through 1942 produced similar weapons. The Finns had the Lahti L-39 anti-tank rifle. The Soviets developed the PTRD and PTRS. All shared the same underlying truth. They were better than nothing, but only just. By late 1943, the Smith gun's operational utility had effectively ended. The invasion threat had passed. Production of proper anti-tank guns had accelerated. The Home Guard was being re-equipped with projector, infantry, anti-tank weapons, and American-supplied bazookas. Many Smith guns were withdrawn from service and scrapped. Some ended up as range targets, others were dumped in quarries or buried as obstacles in defensive positions that were subsequently abandoned. A handful found their way to museums. Surviving examples are rare. The Imperial War Museum in London holds one of the most complete specimens, restored to firing condition, though obviously not actually fired. The Muckleburgh collection in Norfolk has another, displayed alongside other Home Guard weapons from the invasion scare period. Photographs from 1940 are more common than physical guns, showing Home Guard crews posing with their improbable weapons, wheels vertical, barrels angled skyward, expressions ranging from determined to bemused. Sussex, England, August 1940. 3 men crouch behind a farm cart that isn't a farm cart. Overhead, the reconnaissance aircraft has vanished, its photographs already on their way to German intelligence officers who will study them and see nothing unusual. Just fields, hedgerows, country lanes. The Home Guard crew lower their weapon back to its travelling position, pin the carriage into place, hitch it to their Morris and tow it back to the barn where it lives between exercises. They never fire it in anger. The invasion never comes. The German tanks that the Smith gun was designed to destroy instead roll east into Russia, where they meet different defenses and different fates. By 1943, the gun in the barn is obsolete. By 1945, it's scrap. By 1950, it's mostly forgotten. But in that August moment, with the reconnaissance aircraft still visible in the distance and the shells still in the breach and German invasion barges massing in French ports, the Smith gun represents something that statistics and production figures and armour penetration tables can't quite capture. It represents the distance between what Britain had and what Britain needed. It represents improvisation elevated to industrial policy. It represents the gap between a proper army and an armed citizenry, and the desperate ingenuity required to bridge that gap with 3 inches of steel tube mounted on bicycle wheels. 4,000 guns, perhaps a dozen rounds fired in combat. 0 confirmed kills. The Smith gun didn't win the war. It didn't save Britain. It probably wouldn't have stopped the Germans if they'd actually landed. What it did was give aging men with no military equipment something resembling a fighting chance. And in the summer of 1940, when fighting chances were in desperately short supply, that mattered more than the gun's technical limitations ever could. The strangest gun Britain ever fielded. The gun that hid behind its own wheels. The gun that tipped over to fire, then tipped back to look like agricultural equipment. Inadequate, ingenious, and absolutely irreplaceable when there was nothing else to give.